Hello, good evening. I hope everyone is well out there. Welcome to tonight's webinar, The Path to USMLE Success, also known as First Aid, the really short version here. My name is Tal Lee. I will be your host and speaker for tonight. I am an associate clinical professor of allergy immunology at the University of Louisville, but you folks know me better as the senior editor for First Aid for the USMLE Step 1, Step 2 CK, Step 3, and so forth. I'm also the founder and chief education officer for ScholarRx, USMLE-Rx. So that's our question banks, our videos, our bricks, and digital flashcards. And I know many of you are users. Thank you, and I hope you find these to be useful resources. But tonight we're here to help you. With me, we've got a couple of wonderful colleagues, Jeff, Kat, and Louise, who will help answer questions along the way. So if you are on the desktop, on a PC, you'll notice that there may be a question panel on the right side. I think the same thing with Macs. And if you are on a mobile device, like an Android or iPhone device, you can also ask questions as well. So we'd love to hear from you. And you know, my team, my colleagues will do their best to help answer your questions about preparing for USMLE and also any of our resources. So let's go ahead and get started. The first word in the book of first aid is relax. That's been the way it's been for 34 years, and there's a whole reason for that. It's because we really want you to take a deep breath and think about the long view in terms of preparing for the exam. You know, we often have a tendency to get really anxious with big exams like USMLE and start to get very narrow viewed in terms of how we need to prepare. So again, if you just slow down and let the exam come to you, then you're going to be in a much better position to achieve what you want to get out of the exam. All right, so what is our itinerary for the night? What's our agenda? So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to review the basics of the USMLE Step 1. We'll talk about some changes that have been happening in the USMLE. Talk about defining your goals, timelines for studying, how to approach subjects, choosing resources, some study tips that have stood the test of time. We will have a raffle for some ScholarRx, USMLE-Rx resources like our question banks, video resources, bricks, and so forth. And we do have a special offer tonight as well too. And then I'll stick around for some Q&A, and we'll see how far we can go past the top of the hour. All right, so I want to see who's out there tonight and what's going on, and wake you up. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to launch a question here, and I want to know who you are. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this. So you should see a question popping up. So go ahead and give me an answer, and we'll wait 15, 20 seconds for responses to come in. All right, looks like about 25% of you have voted. So I'm going to keep it open. It does take some time to collate all these results. So even if you have voted, it may take a couple of seconds for it to register for whatever reason. Looks like votes are coming in fast. We're now over 75%. Give it another second. Just want to make sure that the folks are awake. Okay, over 80% have voted. I think that's plenty good. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share it with you all. And what you see is that we've got about 20–25% US medical students, mostly allopathic, some osteopathic. And then we have quite a few international medical graduates, some born in the US, but the majority are coming from outside the United States. So welcome everybody. Again, really appreciate you being here. And if you want, in the question box, you can just let us know where you're at. Looks like we've got a DO student from LECOM. Welcome. And if there's other folks, happy to hear where you guys are from. And I suspect there are some folks from, international, Europe, Asia, and so forth. So welcome to everyone. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hide this and go back to the presentation. All right, there's another also from Turo. Well, that's cool. Which Turo? There's a couple Turos. New York. I think there's one in Vegas. All right. Oh, India. Oh, they're coming in. India, Temple, Nigeria. KSA. Where is that? Ukraine. I hope you guys are hanging in there. Texas. New York. Oh, that must be the Turo. Vietnam. I was just there a couple weeks ago. Happy Lunar New Year. Chúc mừng năm mới. AT still. UAG. So down south. All right, so we've got quite the spread of folks. Welcome, Ross, Puerto Rico, New Zealand. I would love to visit New Zealand one day. Other folks from Puerto Rico, Saudi Arabia. I was just in United Arab. I was just in Dubai actually a couple of weeks ago as well too. Indonesia, Serbia, Iraq, Texas, Vietnam. That's interesting. Dubai. Hey, there you go. Somebody there. Oh, KSA is in Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's cool. Venezuela, Haiti, Kazakhstan. Okay. All right, cool. Anyway, it's just great to see all the international folks. I could sit here and read where you're from all night long, but we do have to move on. Abidjan, Cuba. All right, so the exam is, so again, this is, by the way, a step one focus. And I saw somebody asking about whether there's a step two. We have some, but this is really a step one focus talk here. So this is the step one is a one-day test. It has 280 questions, 7 1-hour blocks. So that's 40 questions per block. That means 90 seconds per question, and you have 45 minutes of break time. This is a simple schematic. You have, again, I mentioned the 7 blocks. These are in blue. You do have an orientation block at the very beginning. You do get 15 minutes to do that, and if you do it, and if you download and you ran the app off of USMLE.org, you've actually already done this module before. So almost everybody has done this, especially if you've done anything like the free 120 or whatnot. And so the only reason to get into this block is to actually go in and check the audio, the headset volume, and then you move on. And then, and if you move on, you can actually change, say 15 minutes, and you'll get close to 60 minutes of break time. All right, the exam is a single best answer. There may be 4 choices, 5 choices, 6 choices, but you're going to have to choose the single best version of that. There are a few questions that have multimedia, so that may be heart sounds, lung sounds, maybe gait disorders. Almost all the questions are scenario-based, whether it's case-based or science-based or public health-based. And the majority of the questions have some sort of multi-step reasoning involved. What does that mean? That means that they test multiple concepts together. They may start off with a pathology condition, then you have to figure out what's going on, then you have to figure out what the next step. So here is an example of something that could present on the USMLE Step 1. So a 32-year-old woman presents with a 5-day history of occasional double vision and bilateral ptosis. What is the most appropriate diagnostic test? So what you'll notice here is that this is the case, this one sentence here, that is called the stem. And then this last sentence, which is what is the most appropriate diagnostic test, is called the lead-in. It's the question. It's what do we want to know? What do we want to answer based on the information that was just given here? So one thing you'll notice is that when you look at this case, you'll notice that the first thing you want to do is you want to answer, well, what's the diagnosis? But you recognize that it's not asking about the diagnosis. It's actually asking how do you get to the diagnosis? What's the most appropriate diagnostic test. Well, to get to that, then you actually have to have a hypothesis of what's the most likely diagnosis. In this particular case, it's this younger woman who has these bilateral findings, neurological findings, particularly around the eyes, if you notice it. So in this particular case, the most likely cause is going to be likely myasthenia gravis. You could make an argument for multiple sclerosis, but they tend to have more unilateral findings. So if you do believe that this is myasthenia gravis, then what is the most appropriate test? And if you want to, I'd love to see if people want to like throw it into the question chat or whatnot. But in this particular case, yep, it's going to be, anti-acetylcholinesterase antibodies, is the most likely, most appropriate diagnostic test for this condition. Some people would, yep, and I saw somebody just throw it in there. Somebody would go to the tensilon test, and that would have been an appropriate answer in the United States several years ago. Tensilon test is no longer available in the United States. It's still available, I think, in other parts of the world, so it may be appropriate there. But remember, this is a U.S. exam, so just beware that diagnostic tests do evolve, and what was classic may no longer be appropriate. All right, and so again, an example of a two-step question. All right, let's move on and look at the interface. So what you see here is the Prometric interface. They use Windows computers. You are given, a question screen where, again, you see the question. Again, it has the two parts, the stem, and then the lead-in. You have navigation across the top, navigation across the bottom as well, too, including the all-important timer. You'll notice that you've got 5 to maybe 7 choices, most likely, and that you also have images or some visual data around 10 to 20% of the time. You can lock the exam if you need to go use the facilities, the restroom, or whatnot, but the timer will keep running. You can change any of your answers while you're in the block. When you exit the block, if there is any time left over, it rolls over into your break time. Also, once you exit the block, you can no longer go back and change any of the answers within that block. All right, so now let's keep on going. And again, I see some good questions coming in. I'm going to, again, let my team answer those questions. All right, so now let's talk about scoring and pass rate. So as we all know, step 1 has been pass fail for a while. It's still gated on 196. So if you recall, it used to be a 3-digit scoring system with the theoretical max of around 300, and the mean was 230 with a standard deviation of 20. So that's what you would have seen when they were reporting numbers a couple of years ago. The passing rates is a very interesting story, and certainly don't want to alarm you, but it's not necessarily, unfortunately, a good story. What you'll notice is that over the past couple of years, particularly from 21 to 2022, the passing rates dropped significantly. For allopathic, from 95 to 91%. Same thing with osteopathic, 94 to 89%. And for IMGs, 82 to 74%. Now, this is for first-time test takers. So you'll notice, if we go look at the MDs, the allopathics, you'll see that drop. Interestingly, however, the repeaters, actually did better. So there were some questions that perhaps the exam just got harder. USMLE has said that's not the case. These are the same level of difficulty and so forth. The other hypothesis is that this was COVID related, and that could be. But we think that the most likely reason is that there was a psychological effect of the exam going USMLE going pass fail, and that misled some students into thinking that the exam wasn't as important. They didn't prepare as much. And then the ones that were marginal to begin with were the ones that failed. Again, it's not a, it's 4%. So it's not everyone, but it's enough to, I think, get everybody's attention. The 2023 data is not out yet. I do expect to see a rebound, but we'll see. Hopefully they'll be posting that very soon, now that people still realize that the USMLE is still a very hard exam. Again, as I mentioned, this is the data for the international medical graduates with the dip, and as you'll see, those who repeated, there was really no change, which again lends credence to the exam, not the exam changing, but how people approached the exam once it went past fail. All right. They used to report percentiles. They don't anymore. But what's interesting to know is that that there was an S curve that's based on percentile versus the 3-digit score. So this is more of historical interest. The key thing now with the USMLE being pass fail is that the step 2 CK now becomes the new screening tool. And so this is the mnemonic roads to riches. And this certainly specifies the specialties that are very competitive, that most likely use the USMLE, what used to be step 1, now step 2, as a screening tool. So radiology, radiation oncology, the surgical subspecialties, ortho, opto, otolaryngology, aesthetics, plastic surgery, and then dermatology. All right. The next thing I want to mention is that there were some recent changes to the USMLE content outlined just in the last couple of weeks. We consider these to be minor. They were implemented a few weeks ago, and they impact all 3 USMLE steps. So what happened? Well, basically, there was a category called General Principles of Foundational Medicine, and they removed that category, and all the topics have been redistributed to other categories, including other organ systems, and they did create a new category called Human Development. That being said, they have said that none of the foundational science actually got removed. They just got moved to other parts in the outline, and the proportions of questions that are going to foundational science content has not changed and is not expected to change. So in other words, they kind of moved they rearranged some chairs, but all the chairs are still there, and all the chairs are still weighted the same way. So this should not impact, I don't think, how you prepare for the exam. All right, I notice people still are asking questions. That's great. And what we'll certainly do is I'll ask my colleagues, to keep track of the thematic questions that keep coming up over and over again, and we'll try to address them, at the end. All right, next, let's go to choosing study strategies. So a couple of things to keep in mind. You already have been successful with standardized exams, where you came from, whether it's United States, Canada, internationally, you all got here. So congratulations, you already have shown your academic acumen. So you have developed at least study habits and test taking habits that have been effective up to this point. You do need to take into consideration the structure and characteristics of the subject, how it can be best be studied. For example, certain subjects like microbiology and pharmacology have information that is organized in very similar ways from a conceptual standpoint. So such like bugs and drugs. And so with that, you can use tables and flashcards because the relationships are the same. So you don't have to worry about rebuilding the schema. You just need to know what's related to A and what's related to B. Whereas things like physiology is more relationship based, So you need to think about maybe mind mapping or other techniques or diagramming. You also need to know about the strengths and weaknesses of your curriculum. Your curriculum may be good at having you apply and integrating clinical concepts or basic science concepts, or it may not. And it may be deficient in certain disciplines or organ systems. So you got to keep that in mind when you need to supplement that with other exam prep resources, whether it's first aid or a question bank or some other resource. And then you need to think about the time you assign to a particular study subject, and recognize that you can use different types of techniques such as flashcards, question banks, games, whatnot. So the more time you have, the more techniques you can use. All right. Let's see. Before I go into this, I realized that I missed a question. So I want to see if you're still awake. I do want to know actually when you plan on taking the exam. So wake up. I'm going to ask a question. I want to know if you're going to be taking it really soon or much later. So we'll open up this poll for about 20 seconds, and I'll share the results with all of you. All right, we're seeing results come in. Only a couple percent so far. We'll leave it open for a bit. All right, 25% have answered. All right, 2/3 have answered. We'll wait a couple more seconds. All right. Nearly most of you have answered, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, share the results. And what you'll see is that the majority of folks will be taking it this year, mostly between May and the end of the year. That makes sense. Those are pretty popular time in the US and also internationally when people are transitioning between their different years at their university. But I can see that some folks are planning for the long view, so that's fantastic as well. And then there's a couple of folks who are going to turn right around and take it really, really soon. So best of luck to you folks. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put away that poll and get back to the presentation. So we're going to spend some time talking about approaching these various subjects and disciplines. Keep in mind that I'll be using a discipline, I'll be sharing advice by discipline, but it will apply across organ systems. And then there will be a couple of key themes that you'll see me iterate over and over. And I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you right away, so you can kind of see it play out through these slides with regards to the advice. One is, despite this exam being called a basic science exam, it's actually fairly clinical, because all the vignettes themselves are case-based. So there's more clinical than some folks may initially appreciate. And then number two, as I mentioned, because the majority of the questions, or up to half the questions, are multidisciplinary, or they involve multi-step reasoning, you need to think about how you integrate everything. So none of these facts, none of these concepts stand by themselves. They have to be integrated with others in a way that makes sense, that helps with clinical diagnosis, with understanding the mechanism of disease once you make the diagnosis, or understanding mechanisms when it comes to class effects, from a pharmacology standpoint. So think about how you can integrate all of those concepts together in a way that makes clinical, diagnostic, and treatment sense. All right, so that's the big picture. So with that, let me jump into some of the specific advice. So anatomy, is low yield when it comes to gross anatomy. But again, anything that's clinically relevant, like what happens, what what landmarks are used in common surgeries like the appendectomy? What happens if a person has a spiral fracture of the humerus, presents to your emergency room, and it severs a nerve, one particular nerve that's in the humeral groove? What happens to your motory and sensory sensation in your hand, right? And where might deficits occur? Neuroanatomy, embryology are fairly, small, self-contained subjects that haven't changed in many, many years, at least not drastically. So there's certain things that can be high yield there, and with embryology, you'll often see it with congenital disorders. You will see cross-sectional anatomy, but almost always as in clinical imaging, such as X-ray CTs. And then, of course, you'll see histopathology as well. Biochemistry is crammable, so it's one of a couple areas crammable. I saw a question earlier that kind of came through about when to study what and so forth. And things that are crammable, you can potentially circle back towards the very end when you got a couple days where you could try to take advantage of your short-term memory capacity to get certain facts that in your head that might be high yield but are hard to remember. Biochemistry is high yield because the big portion of it involves metabolism, and so there is a regularly repeating concept with regards to pathways, the substrate for the pathways, the products of those pathways, and the key regulatory enzymes. Otherwise, from a clinical standpoint, things that involve biochemistry includes vitamin deficiency, so you'll see that in first aid, disease of genetic errors, and so forth. And then with regards to the science of medicine, there are certain laboratory techniques, so lab medicine, so understanding what is RT-PCR, what does it do, what does it do in the science lab, what does it do in a diagnostic or treatment lab, same thing with flow cytometry, and other modern lab techniques. So just understand how they are used, what it actually does, what parts of what are the biomarkers that it works with and whatnot, what kind of information does it yield, and how can it be applied both in discovery of new knowledge and also in diagnosis and management of patients. All right, microbiology also is potentially crammable because there are concepts that repeat all the time, and I'll get to you in that just a bit. So the other key thing here with microimmunology is that it's not just about bacteria. We always think about bacteria, but there's so much more to it. And again, it can be a little more crammable. And like I said, I don't want to oversell it, but it can be a little more crammable because for a lot of the bugs, there's a repeating schema or conceptual framework of the bug in terms of laboratory diagnosis, the stinging characteristic, knowing where it goes, how does it get there, how do you diagnose it, how do you treat it, what are the vectors, what are the reservoirs. So that is kind of a repeating schema a lot of times for a lot of the bugs. In the age of COVID, the immune response, is critical. We need to know how it works in normal response and abnormal responses. So how do vaccines, manipulate? How do the new RNA vaccines do it? And then also immunodeficiencies. These are very rare, but they are a window in terms of how how does your immune system work. And so they can occasionally show up on the boards as well too. Next, we'll talk about pathology. So path cannot be avoided. It's a huge chunk of the exam, nearly half the exam if you kind of count up all the organ systems and stuff like that. On the outline. Now, so when you approach it, you do need to think about the hallmark characteristics, particularly for rare conditions. But for very common conditions, you'll see more variation. So for example, when you think about asthma, you always think about wheezing and shortness of breath and stuff like that. But in children, sometimes asthma, and in even adults and children, asthma can just show up as a cough, a dry cough and whatnot. And it may be hard to distinguish, at least on the surface level, with other things that can cause cough, like a viral condition or pollution exposure or something else. So you're going to have to put the rest of the story together based on the information in the stem, based on the characteristics of the patient, that type of stuff. Now, think about the characteristics of the patient. The clues should have some relevance if they give it to you. That should help you narrow things down. They can occasionally give you some clues that could be red herrings, but they're not supposed to. And one thing you need to understand is that a lot of times these clues are not pathognomonic. So for example, if the patient is a young woman and has some, or young male, sorry, and has some lymphadenopathy or something like increased mediastinum, there still could be sarcoidosis even if that person is not a black woman. So just because it's a white male doesn't mean that they can't get sarcoidosis either. So just keep those things in mind. We often ascribe, these patient level clues and say, oh yeah, it's, that's a classic presentation. And fair enough, it could be classic. But remember, in real life, your patients don't all, sometimes quote unquote read the textbook, and it's fair game, that there is variation in gender and age and ethnicity and so forth. There are, of course, trigger words that we popularize, we put in first aid, we get the mnemonics and stuff like that. They're very helpful as far as memory aids, but remember, on the USMLE, you will have to know what it clinically means and so forth. So if you do enough Q-Bank questions, you will see some of those common descriptions, instead of the trigger words. And so get used to that. As I mentioned early on, 15 to 20% of the questions will have clinical images, X-rays, CTs, line diagrams, graphs, that type of stuff. There's a tendency for us, particularly if we're a little panicked or we're a little rushed, we'll look at those images first, then try to figure it out. That's the wrong way to do it. Now, if you go to our question labs, and Jeff can give you a link to some of our question labs and whatnot, or invite you to a question lab. We have a specific 7-step method for breaking down these questions, so you don't get flustered and you don't lose your place or whatever. So just remember, never look at the images until you get through the rest of the question. So that includes, looking through the lead-in, looking at the potential distractors, looking at the stem. Then you look at the image last, after, at a minimum, looking after the stem. All right, thank you, Jeff, for putting in the link to the question lab. So pharmacology is also crammable. It tends to repeat schematically or conceptually with mechanisms, so drug mechanisms and toxicities. And again, they'll try to do more class. They got rid of the treatment choices. So you shouldn't be asked, well, like, what's the most appropriate drug for XYZ, whatever. Most of that has moved to the step 2 CK. So with regards to what's high yield in pharmacology, remember, you got to go for the prototypes and the big variants. You got to, you can skip, obscure derivatives unless you're really, really trying to get a high pass, if you will. You can also avoid, you can also forget trade names and dosages, again, unless it's helpful to you as from a kind of a memory aid mnemonic perspective. There are multiple classic categories like autonomic, CNS, antimicrobial, cardiovascular, and oncology, and those are all, covered at a very, very high level within first aid. And because they do obviously relate to therapeutics, you often then see them integrated with patho, pathophysiology and other related subjects that will impact what you think about the drugs and how they may impact certain pathways at a cellular or molecular level, etc. Physiology, as I mentioned earlier, is concept oriented, so it's really about the relationships. So as I mentioned, diagramming, mind maps help, and again, they're almost always incorporated into clinical vignettes, often with integrated pathology. So multiple concepts there. Psychiatry is in first aid. We kind of put it all together. It's a mix of psychology, sociology, psychopharmacology. There is a tendency for us to focus on mood disorders like depression, dysthymia, and so forth, but don't forget there's a lot of other high yield stuff, such like personality disorders, psychosomatic, and so forth. And again, we covered the highlights in first aid. And then finally, public health, you've got a mix of biostats, epi, ethics. More recently, in the last several years, they added healthcare delivery, patient safety, quality improvement. Something it tends to be aggregated under what's called population health or health system science. Biostats and epidemiology is very classic, and hasn't changed a bunch. So, it does tend to go into public health, public policy, and you'll see in those types of scenarios. Several years ago, they added they expanded the doctor-patient interaction. So you'll be given a scenario where you have to interact with a patient and their family, and they're going to pose a conundrum to you, and then you have to reply with, with a response. And we call these quote questions because you'll have a question and then you'll have to answer with a verbal response. All right, so that was a quick walk through what's high yield. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about review resources. So there's all kinds of stuff out there. There are, Q banks. There are, text reviews such as first aid. There are videos, flashcards, all kinds of apps. And I suspect you folks are using quite a few of those resources out there. So some advice about picking and applying those. So number one, we as a community service have a guide to these review resources in first aid. It's section 4. We put the abbreviated version there. There's an expanded version that's posted online, and Jeff has told me that we just posted it. So I think he can potentially post a link, and you can access that at no cost at firstaidteam.com. And so once you use that guide to kind of help identify what might be high yield for you and so forth, you consider a couple things. One, use these resources along with your class studies. It's best if you can integrate it along with your curriculum. So you're going to get two birds with one stone. You'll be better prepared for your classes and better prepared, really, hopefully, as a compassionate future doctor. But also, should help you with the prep, especially when you review it again. Try not to overload yourself. It's really more important that you're systematic in terms of going through a limited but high yield set of resources and doing them more completely. Use spaced repetition where it's effective, and use certain techniques like the testing effect to your favor. And again, we'll talk about that later. So you can always get these things later if you think that you're under-resourced, because almost anything's on demand electronically and or digitally, and or you can get it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble if it happens to be a good old-fashioned book. And then remember that certain resources are good in certain areas and may not be good in certain areas others. So you'll just need to kind of keep that in mind when selecting resources. So I'm going to now ask another question. Been bombarding you with a lot of information, so this is a multi-answer, so it could be none of the above or all of the above, but I do want to know what resources are you using or would like to be using to prepare for the boards, and I'll share it with everyone. So This will take a little bit longer to collate the answers, so I'll leave it open for maybe 30 seconds. So hopefully we'll start getting some answers soon a little bit. Like I said, it could be all of the above or none of the above, but I suspect that most of you are using at least a couple of these resources. So let's find out what you got. All right, we've got about 40%, 60%. We'll wait a couple more seconds. All right, we've got nearly 3/4 of you folks have answered, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to share the results here. And unsurprisingly, almost everybody uses question banks. Virtually everybody uses question banks. Most of you are using review books like First Aid or videos, and a fair number are using flashcards, and some are using mobile apps. So that's pretty good. And in the past, I've also asked about other resources like syllabi. I'll say historically about, you know, 20 to 35% of you will also use your class notes and whatnot. But fair enough, they often aren't high yield or really ruthlessly organized to help, you know, prepare for the boards. All right, let me go ahead and put the poll away. Let's go back to the presentation. So let's talk about some study advice here. So there's a couple of things that students have found and IMGs have found to be really useful in terms of approaches to preparation over the years. One is you want to establish a study schedule and stick with it. I think I saw Jeff add a link somewhere to our study schedules tool. Thought I saw it. If not, he'll post it very, very shortly. And and the idea is you plan ahead. If you plan properly, you won't really need to reshuffle your schedule. Sometimes when students panic or get really, really concerned, they'll start shifting things up, and it causes havoc with their approach, and it often causes more harm than good. As I mentioned earlier, integrate and apply everything. There's a lot of multi-step questions, and medicine is an integrated sport. You got to pull things together. You got to pull related concepts and sometimes unrelated concepts to make the diagnosis, to critically think through your patient scenario, and and give them the proper treatment. I mentioned about the crammable subjects. So advice number one, like I said, I would align your studying with what you're doing in your curriculum, because it's 2 for 1. But if you're in dedicated, or if you're not in school and whatnot, you can cover these subjects either similar how you studied in medical school. If not, I would consider foundational sciences and some of the basic type stuff like inflammation and stuff, and then move towards organ system where you can apply it, and then and you integrate with therapy. So then do it integrate, and then at the very end come back to some of those crammable subjects like metabolic pathways, bugs and drugs, where you can take advantage of some short-term memory. But again, otherwise, we do not advise cramming, because it's the USMLE, after all, is testing what most people learn over a period of 1.5 to 3 years, depending on what kind of school curriculum you have. When you're studying, it's best to focus on things that you've studied before and you learned before. That is high yield, as per First Aid or other trusted resources. The other thing is, and this gets back to scheduling, don't overschedule. Treat yourself like a real human being that you truly are. There's, particularly during the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about burnout and resilience issues and so forth. And so you got to exercise some self-care, some restraints. You got to make sure that there's break time. I strongly advise that you take a day off a week, even in dedicated study mode, to be a human being, exercise, get out there, be with friends, family, loved ones, and decompress the brain. It turns out that the brain needs time to process. So if you're studying all the time, you're not actually giving your brain time to solidify some of the memories. The other thing is that if you don't get enough sleep, then you don't also get time to solidify those memories. So if you're pulling 12-hour days and you're only getting like 6 hours of sleep or 5 hours of sleep, and you're kind of pushing it from that perspective, you may be doing, again, yourself more of a disservice. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, stay relaxed, keep the long view in mind. Don't get distracted by short-term stuff, and then you'll be fine. We do have a checklist in the front of the book. It's right after the acknowledgments, and it can help you organize your approach in the years, months, weeks, and even days before the exam. Okay, now let's talk about the exam as a computer-based test, CBT. So as I mentioned, there's that tutorial that you'll see at USMLE.org. There are some keyboard shortcuts. Some people like keyboard shortcuts. It's the minority, admittedly, but that might be helpful for some. And it's the thing about computer-based testing is that it works really well when you can continue to do Q&A all the way through and apply Q&A even if you've not fully mastered the subject. There's a lot of science behind that. It was published in the journal Science several years ago, where they randomized college students to learning science materials 4 different ways. And what they found is that when they randomized them to studying at once, concept mapping, retrieval practice, which is self-testing, and basically repeated cramming, which is what I did, when I was a medical student and didn't know any better, that retrieval practice actually works the best because it forces you to actually recall what you're doing. And when you do that, you strengthen your ability to those pathways to recall. So you see that they clearly did better, and they still did better even when the questions were more complex inferential questions. So what are the testing options out there? Well, of course, there's the USMLE called the Free 120. So that's helpful format familiarity. They may or may not be a thing. They did update a little last year, so they're a little better. You also have the NBE-CB-SSA. This stands for the Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment. There's always 5 or 6 forms out there. They're always introducing new ones and retiring old ones. It's helpful for benchmarking. They cost about $50-$60. You can get a couple hundred questions, and it'll give you, when you're done, it'll give you an estimate of how you might do on the actual exam, and it will also give you some feedback on where your strengths and weaknesses are. And the newer ones now also come with answers and explanations. And then there's question banks like RX, UWorld, and so forth. So these are super helpful for practice and study and simulation, and they can also predict your outcomes. So on RX, we not only predict whether you pass or fail, but we'll also give you what we think your theoretical 3-digit score is, because we still think that's a helpful number to use to help guide how much you study. Because as I mentioned, when the exam went pass fail, people lost that 3-digit score, and so they really have no sense of where they were in terms of their readiness for exam. So we've always said, like, if you're using USMLE-Rx and you're scoring 220, 230 on the simulated exams, or you're using the self-tests that we have, then you're generally fine in terms of passing. So let's talk about the learning science in terms of preparing for the board. So there's a couple of things that are out there. Now, again, all this research was done when USMLE was not pass-fail. So we're going to have to extrapolate a little bit, but I think a lot of this science still applies. The first thing is that QBanks are more effective than flashcards. And I think people most intuitively know that, but I think it's assuring that there's research that shows it. There was a study at Washington University, St. Louis, that showed that QBanks are more effective, and mostly because they simulate the real thing, where flashcards are more componentized, and they may or may not be asking exactly the types of questions that actually show up on the boards. I mean, they're helpful for other things for sure, and they overall help, but Q banks are more effective. You know, when the exam was, when the exam had a 3-digit score, what researchers found is that students would have to do 300 or 450 questions to get one extra point on the boards. So for example, if you do all of USMLE-Rx, you can get about 12 extra points. And in terms of the number of questions that you do, people say you should do more than 3,000 questions, or that will give you the best one on average. Now everybody's different, right? So what works for you may be different for somebody else, but on average, the research says the more questions, the better. 3,000 was the top. 3,200 was the top tertile or whatnot that they studied, that they measured in the study at University of Michigan. The other thing they found is that when it comes to doing questions, it's the unique MCQs that help really take advantage of that self-testing testing effect versus repeat MCQs, because I know I've heard it, you've heard it. Hey, do X, Y, and Z question bank 3 times, you'll be fine. The problem is you run into an issue called fluency. Fluency is where you run into something and you think you know it because you've seen it before, but you really don't know. You just have that vague sense of familiarity, and sometimes people get a question right not because of the actual question itself, or they were able to logically reason, or they actually had learned the right concept, or it's because of something that was incidental to the question. Like the person came in wearing a red checker shirt. Oh, that was the patient that had malaria last time, right? And so somehow you associate red checker shirt with malaria, but obviously that's not what's going to happen on the USMLE. So remember, it's unique questions. So all this here about 3,000 questions or whatnot, it's based on doing unique questions. So most people will have to do at least a couple of question banks, at least to get the coverage that they need. And then the last thing, and again, this was done by the research, we weren't involved in it, but students that do and IMGs that do go through first aid at least 3 times do better than those that did not. Now that being said, just simply rereading first aid and highlighting is not active learning. You have to learn first aid actively. So that means making flashcards, or are using resources like our RX Flash Facts, which have digital flashcards that are key to first aid. And when you do it, you are actually actively learning first aid, because then we'll show you where in first aid you missed it or you got it. All right, so that's the learning science. Now let's talk about test day itself. So a couple of things. One is we tend to get really amped up for the test. So just remember that, keep that in mind when you're taking stimulants like coffee. You're going into a office building. More often than not, they tend to run things cold. So come in with some layered clothing, and you can adjust it for comfort, during the day. We mentioned earlier that that you've got 90 seconds per question. Some of the questions can have a long stem. So for those, you might want to read the lead in first. And as a matter of fact, if you use our 7-step method, you're going to do that anyway. But even if you do your own method, just keep in mind that you might want to go to the lead in first, particularly if it's a bigger question. In terms of managing the clock, we talked about the 90 seconds per question. That being said, I recommend that you commit to a answer, or at least a preliminary answer, within 70 to 75 seconds. So, what that would do is that if you commit to that, when you get through all 40 questions, then you'll have something like 10 minutes left over or something like that. And if you mark the questions that are most solvable, and again, that would be questions where you can eliminate 2 or 3 of the distractors and get it down to, I don't know, 2 or 3 choices. Then you might be able to go back and review them and see if you can figure those out. But again, only do it for 8 to 10 because you may not have enough time to get through all of them. Think about making sure you have a light lunch or you snack through every couple blocks, and schedule that time for when you tend to have low energy. One way of figuring that out is by setting up an all-day simulation in USMLE-Rx, and you can figure that out and then plan your breaks accordingly, whether you go 2 blocks a break, 2 blocks a break, or 3 blocks a break, or 2 blocks, and then lunch or whatever. And then the last thing is a joke we've had in med school called the C reflex, because there are some C nerve fibers, in your airways. So the idea here is that there are going to be some questions where you have no idea what's going on. It's medical science is vast. It's not possible that you have read and learned everything, even if you've done thousands of questions. They will occasionally find stuff that you don't know. And a couple of things to keep in mind. One is, like I said, it's hard, spectrum, easy, hard question. And number 2, there are experimental questions. Sometimes there may be a dozen. We don't know for sure. And you can certainly hope that some of those, if you're running into a question that seems impossible, perhaps it's one of those experimental questions and it won't count. So the key thing there is to quickly identify whether you can really answer the question or not. And you can, then be truthful to yourself. Say, hey, look, there's no way if I spend an hour, I'm not going to get it, because it may be something you never covered, whatnot, and that's okay. You're not going to get all 280 questions right. So what you do is you choose a letter like C or B, and our group chose C. Pick that out, especially if you can't narrow any of the choices, and then move on. And the key thing there is to capture back as much time from that one question that you're not going to get. Take your best guess, and then you can apply it to other questions that are much more solvable. So that's, I know that was a little bit of a wordy explanation about how to use the C reflex as a strategy, but it's all about recognizing where the question is unsolvable, and then your job there is to harvest back as much time as possible. For those of you who know the application, normally when you log in, you get into USMLE-Rx, and that's kind of like your default homepage. And the way to get to bricks is over here. So it's going to be at the upper and left. You can also get to them over here as well. We're gonna be redoing this, and you'll see bricks more prominently in the future. So anyway, you can just click this. You'll get into what's called the brick exchange. And this is where you can get access to the bricks that you subscribe to, or you can see the bricks that are being shared by others, including potentially your classmates who are publishing with their school, and then the school publishes their bricks. So you can see these are the various, what we call collections. You can click here in the essentials. If your school is already using us, then you can click here to see how they've organized it, get your favorites and so forth. And the bricks, what you'll notice with the bricks is that they're very they're very easy to learn, easy to engage learning experiences. It's a mix of words, images, audio, occasionally multimedia and video as well too. And what you'll notice is that each of the bricks has basically a podcast feature, so you can essentially just listen to the brick. And you notice that we've got clear learning objectives, so you know what you're going after. All the bricks have a conceptual case that allows you to puzzle through what might be going on. So it primes you for critical thinking and clinical reasoning, which is what we all want to be as good doctors. So you can see that it's rich with images, text, definitions, recommendations of other learning resources, other bricks. And some of the images are interactive, and you can see that we have active learn questions that are basically flashcards. And so these are good basic comprehension questions, and and then as you go along, you keep getting engaged, because what you'll notice that this is not like a normal textbook. We keep asking you questions every couple of days. We want you to apply it. We want you to integrate the information. We want you to critically think through it. And so it's a great exercise in forcing you to pull all these things together. So it's, if your brain hurts, that's a good thing, actually. And that's kind of like you training your muscles, right? So you want to feel the burn there. And then, at the end, I'm just going to move to the end here. You can see that we give you the end of the story. We ask you a question about what's going on in the X-ray, and then we explain that, hey, this person has an enlarged left atrium. What's going on? And what do you do with it? And so forth. And it's in a clinically realistic situation that you will be seeing as either in your clinical clerkships, or even if you're in IMG, you've probably seen some of these things already if you've already been in clinical practice. Then we give you a high yield summary in bullet form, and then we give you some review questions so that you can apply them. Some of them are USMLE style, some of them more straightforward, and you'll notice that you don't get the explanation until you get the correct answer, and then you'll notice that we do try to give you an explanation for each of the distractors. And then finally, you can give us some feedback. We give you some references, and then you can check off which learning objectives you are most comfortable with, if you particularly in a learning environment. And then we link you to other resources, including high yield facts and flashcards and questions and so forth. So that's an overall view of a brick. And again, if you're at a school that's using it, some of your schools are modifying these bricks. They're contextualizing for your needs. And as I mentioned, some of your professors are creating bricks. But as I mentioned earlier, you can create your own bricks. And there are schools that are actually training the students to create their own bricks, and they're actually contributing to the school. But like I said, you don't have to wait. It's actually open access to anybody who wants to create a brick and get some of their education out there. I should mention that there are some additional functions down here. They're self-explanatory. You can favorite a brick. You can also add it to a list. So you have a certain reading list. So here's my biochem read list. I could add it to a list or create a new list. Or you can always maintain the table of contents if you want to quickly be able to figure out where you're at, right? So you can see that the colors change as I scroll through the various parts of the brick here. And then you can also give us feedback. We want to improve these education resources, so you can give it. And by the way, if you are the first to report an error, you can get an Amazon gift card. So we are willing to pay you for any mistakes we make if you're the first to catch it, and also if you can significantly improve our bricks or our question banks. So and there's more, but I'll leave it at that. So again, thank you, folks. Really appreciate you spending time with us, and we recognize that this can be a stressful journey, but there are many people that are doing it with you. So please support each other. It turns out that within learning psychology, you do better actually when you also support other people as well too. So stick together, help each other. You'll all get through it, and then give us some advice about how we can make our resources better, so that future students, future IMGs have a better journey to where they want to go. And so we look forward to that feedback and look forward to seeing you folks on the other side. So with that, have a wonderful evening. Again, appreciate all the love from everyone, and good luck. Thank you all. And then finally, I want to thank my team, Jeff, Kat, Louise, for helping organize this session and answering many of your questions. And again, if we couldn't get to your questions, we apologize. But again, we are available on social media, so don't hesitate to reach us out there as well too. All right, good night.